welcome to our sixth lecture in the Teaching Company series on the Second World War. In this sixth lecture, we're going to be dealing with the German offensive in the West in the summer of 1940. The stunning attack of the Germans into Norway and Denmark, the blitzkrieg through Holland, Belgium, and into France. We'll be examining the conduct of the war on the Western Front, what one French historian has called the strange defeat of France, this rapid collapse of the French army and the French state in the spring of 1940 in a matter of 35 days. We'll try to examine the reasons for the failure of France in this great moment, this traumatic moment, and the two visions of France that would emerge from these troubled days in the summer of 1940. A collaborationist France associated with the policies of the old Marshal Pétain and the young lion, the Colonel, now General de Gaulle. We had stopped in our last lecture with the observation that as the war came to a close against Poland and then the Russians launched their attack on Finland in November of 1939, a campaign that bogged down and would carry on into March. The question was still unresolved about whether or not there would be a war in the West. Hitler had gambled, desperately hoping that there would be no campaign in Western Europe, had not counted on it, not wanted it. This was not the war he had planned, not the war he anticipated. But his numerous overtures to Britain in particular had fallen on deaf ears. The British showed no inclination to bargain now with Hitler in 1940. And so as the weather began to improve in the West, campaigning weather made its appearance, and the anticipation was of a possible new German offensive in the West. That would come in April of 1940 as the Germans launched an attack in Scandinavia. The Germans had become convinced through their intelligence reading that Great Britain and France were preparing to seize Norway, to seize ports in Norway, to forbid them to the Germans. And Hitler ordered a preemptive strike and an invasion of Denmark. The Germans launched their attack on April 9th, 1940. They quickly overran Denmark with virtually no opposition. And then, despite some trouble, an invasion force of only 10,000 German troops seized Norway, the major ports of Norway. British and French troops arrived only to suffer defeat, humiliation, and were evacuated in May of 1940. So now Hitler had, with very little effort, secured his northern flank, prevented what he was convinced was going to be a British attack there, and now attention was focused on northwestern Europe, on the Low Countries and France. Would there be an attack? On paper, France seemed to be prepared. On paper, the French position was in fact quite strong. The French army was able to match the Germans in terms of number of divisions in the field. In fact, on the eve of the German assault, the French and British together employed 81 divisions, ready to confront the 75 German divisions that would be sent into battle. The French also possessed parity in armor. It is not true that the Germans had more tanks. The French were on virtually equal footing with the Germans in this regard, nor was it a matter of technology. The great German tanks, which would be the terror of the Western Front during the Battle of the Bulge, and to match the Russian T-34 tanks in the East, the Panther and Tiger tanks of a later day were not available to the Germans at this time, and technologically these German tanks were not particularly superior to their British and French counterparts. In many ways, the British Matilda tank was actually superior to the tanks available to the Germans. One could say the same thing about air power, available air power. In May of 1940, the French actually possessed a numerical edge in aircraft, 4,360 to about 3,200 for the Germans. And the latest French models, especially of fighter aircraft, were not inferior to the best German planes. The Me-109, which would be, in the early days of the war, the best German fighter plane, was matched by French counterparts. So, as one thinks about the fall of France that would come in rapid order in May and into June of 1940, it wasn't a matter of simply being overwhelmed by superior numbers or greater tanks, aircraft, and so on. The real key, I think, to the fall of France in 1940 was to lay in its military and political leadership. There were failures of military strategy, tactics, and organization on the part of the French that were key to understanding their failure to deal with the Germans. British and French military thinking during the interwar years continued, and we've talked about this briefly, continued to be dominated by defensive considerations drawn largely from their experiences in the First World War. During that war, the French had been enthusiastic advocates of offensive warfare, all through the First World War, in fact, even when all the evidence was in and these charges across no man's land had been seen to be quite suicidal. The French continued to hold to the view that an army infused with fighting spirit could defeat any defensive force. The élan vital, as the French called it, was the key to success. The effects, of course, during the Great War were little short of devastation. Suicidal charges, vast carnage in all of the major encounters during the war. So after the war was over, the lessons had been drawn. French military planners, for the most part, were convinced that the emphasis in all future planning should be on defensive operations. How does one create a defensive position capable of withstanding a German onslaught? Pétain himself, the great hero of Verdun in 1916, certainly emphasized this point. He would dominate military thinking after 1918, and his view was that the emphasis had to be on defense. There was another problem for the French, another factor in French thinking. With a population of 42 million, France had suffered the highest per capita losses in the First World War. There was no French family, no French village that did not have its grisly lists of fallen heroes from that conflict. France could not afford casualties on the scale of the Great War. This had led in part to the construction of the Maginot Line, defensive positions, defensive fortifications, which would allow the French to maintain the defense of their country without the kind of mass slaughter they had suffered during the First War. Certainly there had been voices in the French military. General Etienne, for example, had believed that the tank would revolutionize warfare and advocated offensive thinking in planning for a new conflict. He had found enthusiastic support from a young colonel, Charles de Gaulle, who would in the course of 1940 be promoted to the position of general and then enter the French cabinet during the crisis days of 1940, both of whom believed in mobile offensive warfare. But the dominant strategic view of the interwar years in France had been on static defense and fortifications. Now, the British had a slightly different set of emphases. We talked about General Fuller, about Little Hart, both men who were really pioneers in developing what would become the Blitzkrieg strategy, emphasizing the importance of offensive operations, of massed armor. But during the interwar years, Fuller and Little Hart were really voices in the wilderness. The Army was the stepchild of British military policy. The Navy was still the centerpiece of British strategic thinking. Britain, obviously, as an island nation, had to maintain high levels of exports and services, shipping, insurance, and so on, overseas investment. And so the Navy was, as it had been literally for centuries, the centerpiece of British strategic thinking. All of those, the sea lanes and so on, had been disrupted by the First World War. Britain had suffered financially as well as in human terms during the war. And a new war, Chamberlain and others thought, would only make matters worse. As a result, Great Britain during the interwar years was reluctant to launch any ambitious rearmament program. There was very little commitment, and certainly during the Great Depression in Britain, it was not as intense as it was in the United States or in Germany, but it had the same effect of sapping the desire to undertake any ambitious rearmament program. On the other hand, if the Navy was the centerpiece, the Army the stepchild, the British were quite innovative in the interwar years in their emphasis on the Air Force. The RAF, the Royal Air Force, had become an independent service during the First World War. It was not simply a part of the Army. And the Air Force seemed to hold out the promise of a less painful solution to Britain's security needs. The British would be among the first to develop the idea of strategic bombing. The Germans, the Russians, the Japanese, the Italians all certainly had talked about the use of air power in the interwar years. There was, through the 1920s and 1930s, as one in military strategic thinking, a great deal of discussion about the role of air power in a coming conflict. There were nightmare scenarios painted. The next war would be a war of the massed bombers raiding civilian centers, panic among the civilian population that would lead a civilian government to sue for peace. But despite the emphasis on this sort of discussion in strategic circles, none of the great powers actually undertook to construct a strategic air force. The Germans, with their Blitzkrieg concept, had used air power as in a tactical way for close support of ground operations. The Germans possessed two-engine bombers, nothing larger. The Soviets were the same. But Britain, in the 1930s, had begun, along with the United States, we'll talk about the Americans a bit later on, but in the 1930s, the British had really begun to think quite systematically about strategic bombing. That is, the use of air power not for close support of military operations, but to strike at the capacity, the industrial capacity of adversaries to make war, to attack their energy sources, to attack their transportation systems, to attack their industrial structures and their industrial workers. And it had begun to develop in the interwar years the plans to construct big four-engine bombers. They would come to be the Lancasters and others during the war. They would be able to fly long distances and to deliver, for the time, very large payloads against these sorts of targets. So for the British, in the interwar years, the Air Force allowed them to be able to think about, well, this is a way to project British power. There's the Navy, that's the traditional way to do it. But now with the Air Force, we will be able to project our power around the globe using these large strategic bombers. The British also, in the interwar years, began to develop fighter defense, new kinds of fighter planes, high-tech fighter aircraft, the Hurricane, the Spitfire, planes that would certainly make their presence felt during the Battle of Britain in the late summer of 1940. These planes were developed as pursuit planes, planes to defend the British Isles, to defend the kingdom against attack from the continent. And they had begun to think very creatively about this. We'll talk more next time when we talk about the Battle of Britain and the possible German invasion of Great Britain in 1940, about the development of radar, which was certainly very important, tied to fighter command within the British Armed Forces. But, having said this, the land army of Great Britain was very weak, despite the introduction of Britain's first peacetime conscription in the course of 1939. The British would send off to France the British Expeditionary Force, a relatively small contingent of British troops, to support the French in their defensive positions against a German attack. And in 1940, British troops had already departed for the continent to take up their positions in northwestern France, anticipating a possible German attack. Well, numerically then, the British and French position was not so bad. Technologically, it was not so bad. But once one gets to looking at command and control, begins to look at organization, then one sees all sorts of problems for the Allies. For one thing, there was a lack of unified command within the French army, which was particularly damaging. The commander-in-chief of French forces was a man by the name of Maurice Gamelin. He was commander-in-chief, but he delegated operational control in northeastern France to another general. Alphonse Georges was his name. So if you think about what this means, you've got a commander-in-chief of the French forces, but he has a separate command for the northeast of France in exactly the area that virtually everyone anticipates a German onslaught to come. This made, to the British, it made very little sense, but there were reasons, political reasons within the French army for this. The division of authority created confusion within the French rank and file, within the French command structure. It was exacerbated by the fact that the two men disliked one another. Indeed, disliked one another a great deal. Communication between their headquarters was poor, and Gamelin often lacked real knowledge of conditions at the front. This is actually one of the most surprising things about the war at this point. I don't think it's so much tanks and aircraft, it's the telephone that is something, a technological advance that the French don't seem to be onto at this point. Messages passed back and forth between Georges and Gamelin in the early stages of the war in the West by motorbike, by courier, rather than by telephone. There is no sense, and you see this over and over again at French headquarters as the crisis breaks on them on May 10th, 1940. They constantly underestimate the impact of speed. They just don't have any sense of, they think they're still working in 1914, 1918. The Germans attack. There's a breakthrough. Okay, so we have time, we pull back a little bit, send our mobile reserves up to the front. We have some time to get this done. But this is not the way the Blitzkrieg operates. It's speed. They don't understand how speed had revolutionized the nature of warfare, don't understand the nature of the Blitzkrieg, and with disastrous consequences. This lack of command control and unity of command was also reflected in a lack of political cohesion within the Third Republic of France. We've already alluded to the fact that French politics during the 1930s had been fractious, had been confrontational, polarized, and certainly one sees this in the course of 1940 as well. Daladier had resigned in March of 1940, succeeded by Paul Reynaud, who, like Churchill, in England had been a critic of appeasement and an advocate of serious military preparations for war for years on end. Reynaud had been one of the only French political figures to be an enthusiastic supporter of the idea of concentrated armored units, armored divisions, which would be the key to the Blitzkrieg. Daladier, he kept on as Minister of War for political reasons. Reynaud detested his predecessor, Daladier, and that feeling was reciprocated. The two men didn't trust one another, and communication was bad there. So political consensus was also lacking. Reynaud held Gamelin in contempt, the general in charge of operations in France. He was too old, Reynaud believed. He was unimaginative. Reynaud was furious with the general over the inept conduct of French operations in Norway. But Gamelin still was the most influential military figure in France, and he was in charge of the planning of the defense of France, for the Allied defense of France, really, and Belgium as well. He was certain that when the German attack came, it would come, as it had during the First War, through Belgium. He had developed what was called the Gamelin Plan to deal with this. On the one hand, there was the Maginot Line along the German frontier, which would protect that front from the Germans. There was the Ardennes Forest, which would act as a block to German armored operations. And so the real key was the defense of the approaches through Belgium. The plan called then for the Allies to send troops rushing into Belgium when the Germans launched their anticipated attack in the West. So the plan was, the Germans will attack, we will send troops rushing into Belgium, catch them before they are able to get very far. The Maginot Line will hold the Ardennes as an anchor of our defense to the east. We don't have to worry about that. And we will take up our positions on the Meuse and Dyle rivers in Belgium. A complicating factor for this was Belgium itself. Belgium, and we've alluded to this in a previous lecture, Belgium had received from Britain and France guarantees of Belgian sovereignty, but Belgium was not a military ally of either country. And what this meant was that Belgium, in the months leading up to the actual invasion in the West, Belgium had been at pains not to provoke the Germans. So British and French military units had not been allowed to move into Belgium in 1939 to take up positions. The French and the British were going to have to wait for the Germans to strike first, and then they would rush their troops into Belgium. King Leopold of Belgium did not want Belgium to be occupied again as it had been during the First War, didn't want the Germans coming in, didn't completely trust the Allies. And what this meant was that the Western Allies, Britain and France, had to anticipate positions without actually having been there before, without having staked out their positions, and this was certainly a difficulty. Now, by this point, the Enigma machine was paying dividends. France was receiving information that suggested that there was going to be a German attack, that it was imminent. The information they received certainly suggested there was going to be an attack, as Gamelin thought there would be, through Belgium. But there was other information too. The Germans seemed to be massing troops not simply along the Dutch and Belgian frontier, but also around the Ardennes. Gamelin simply ignored the intelligence and moved on with his plan. On May 9th, Reynaud, the premier of France, was so fed up with his high command that he fired Gamelin, tried to fire him at any rate. He was blocked in the cabinet. You can't fire the commanding officer of the French army, they said. And so Reynaud himself resigned. So now here you've got a situation with the Germans literally massing along the frontier. The French premier tries to fire his commander-in-chief. The cabinet tells him he can't do it. The French premier resigns in a protest. Gamelin did as well. So at the very top, on May 10th, France has no premier, has no commander-in-chief. And on May 10th, the Germans launched their attack. The attack came just as Gamelin thought it would. The Germans sent troops, not exactly the way they had done it during the First War, where they had gone through Belgium, but not Holland. In this instance, the Germans launched a simultaneous attack on both countries. German infantry units move into the northern part of Holland, and German armored units move into Belgium with great, great speed. This was exactly as Gamelin had expected. The French and British then rushed northward into Belgium to take up their prearranged positions on the Dyle and Meuse rivers. But this is exactly, of course, what the Germans wanted them to do. One of the troubling aspects, you talk about intelligence and the problems of intelligence, the French and British troops moving into Belgium reported an odd thing. The Germans seemed to have virtually total air superiority, but they were not attacking British and French troops as they moved northward into Belgium. Why were they not attacking? What were they doing? What was the point? Well, the point, of course, was that this is exactly what the Germans wanted them to do. They wanted them to rush to these positions in Belgium, because then the second shoe would fall. A three Panzer Corps slammed through the Ardennes forest into Luxembourg and Belgium behind the British and French troops that had gone into Belgium, and began a drive westward across Belgium and northern France, dashing toward the English Channel. They cut off the Allied armies that had rushed to the north. By May 20th, the Germans had reached the coast near the mouth of the Somme River. The general in charge of leading the Panzer, there were two really, that distinguished themselves in this race across northern France and southern Belgium in 1940. One was Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, and the other was a commander by the name of Erwin Rommel, who also would play a very important role in subsequent days in the war. At this point, Guderian now wheeled north. The French and British didn't quite know what the Germans were up to. As the Germans moved more and more toward the coast, would the Germans turn south, wheel around and head toward Paris? Would they go north? What would they do? Well, Guderian now wheeled north toward the French Channel ports of Boulogne, Calais, and Dunkirk. He quickly seized the first two objectives and was less than 15 miles from Dunkirk when his commanding officer, General von Rundstedt, ordered him to halt on May 24th. Guderian and others within the high command all protested directly to Hitler. Guderian was itching. The British expeditionary force was caught. They were sealed off with the channel. The German forces had them basically surrounded. Guderian was absolutely adamant that he had to be given the authority to charge on to the beaches with his tanks and destroy the British who were trapped. Hitler, on the other hand, showing a rare burst of caution, sided with Rundstedt rather than Guderian, and gave the mission of seizing Dunkirk to the German infantry units who were moving down from the north from Holland. It was a prophetic decision. Why? Well, there were military reasons that Hitler and Rundstedt could certainly cite. The terrain around Dunkirk was marshy. It was not good terrain for armored operations. There was concern, Rundstedt certainly had concern that the armor would get bogged down, that there'd be sitting ducks for British aircraft. There was another problem that he also raised, which is that these armored units had dashed across northern France and Belgium without really stopping, and there were maintenance problems. They needed to be able to stop, regroup, tend to the tanks, and so on. Anyway, they felt the British were finished. They were caught. There was no way for them to get off. So it was just a matter of who was going to do it. And they were also afraid of a counterattack from the south. There's also another possibility that's often raised about this decision to stop the panzers short of Dunkirk. And this is a political reason. An argument is frequently made that Hitler stopped the panzers. In fact, Hitler later indicated something of this sort. He stopped the panzers because he wanted the British to be able to evacuate from the continent, to show the British that this was not a war to the finish with them. He had no quarrel with them. He was going to defeat France. This is not the war he wanted. He had no quarrel ultimately with Great Britain, and so he would allow British troops to escape this trap on the continent. I always find that giving Hitler credit for a kind heart, even with political calculation, is probably a big mistake, and I wouldn't put a great deal of faith in this. He certainly indicated it later on, but I think this is not a very serious consideration. The other possibility, and one that was important to him, was that Hermann Goering of the Luftwaffe argued very forcefully that he and his pilots could destroy the British Army without there having to be close combat along the beaches at Dunkirk. The British Army was trapped. The Luftwaffe would establish air superiority over the beaches, cut the British to pieces, and there wouldn't have to be a military operation on the ground. And so Hitler decided, in fact, to halt the tanks. While this was going on, the British commander of the expeditionary forces, General Lord Gort, began the evacuation of the beaches at Dunkirk. It really was, if Hitler's decision is often referred to as the riddle of Dunkirk, the evacuation of British troops off those beaches was really a miracle. It was an incredible logistical feat. The British began evacuating troops off the beaches on May 26th. That evacuation went on until June 4th. They saved over 338,000 troops, overwhelmingly British, though there were some French as well who were caught and evacuated. The British used all sorts of ships, everything from pleasure boats to tugboats, anything that would float that could get across the channel to pull the troops off of the beaches. Meanwhile, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, the fighters distinguished themselves in protecting the embarking troops and the naval craft. It was a momentous development. Meanwhile, the Germans turned south. After the disaster at Dunkirk, the French had hoped to regroup. Reynaud hoped to rally the French people. Churchill made the extraordinary offer, knowing how little the British and French really care for one another in many respects, made an extraordinary offer, which was common Franco-British citizenship, trying to keep the French in the war, that the French would have all the rights of British citizens and so on, subjects, I suppose one would say. Reynaud pledged to Churchill that he would make no separate peace. He brought Philippe-Henri Pétain, the old hero of the First World War, into the government as vice premier to buck up French resistance. Pétain was 85 years old at the time. He replaced Gamelin with Maxime Weygand, another general. He was in his 70s. Weygand hoped to hold a line just north of Paris, but he didn't have his heart in this operation much either. Then on June 10th, Mussolini roused himself in Rome and declared war on France. With the French army collapsing everywhere, the roads of northern France absolutely choked with disintegrating army units, evacuees of all sorts, Mussolini declared war, though he didn't immediately open military operations against France. The so-called Weygand line north of Paris collapsed, and on June 14th, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. Reynaud and his followers wanted to continue the fight from French colonial Africa, but Pétain, whom he had brought into the government to buck up resistance, urged an armistice. And on June 16th, 1940, in the same railroad car in which the Germans had had signed the armistice in 1918, Adolf Hitler accepted the surrender of France. France was allowed to keep its colonial empire and its fleet. The Germans occupied 2/3 of France, the coastal areas in northern France. A new French regime was set up in Vichy with Marshal Pétain as the head of state. And Charles de Gaulle, now a general, refused to recognize the surrender or the collaborationist Vichy regime, escaped to London, set up his own government, and began to organize Free French military forces for hopefully a liberation of France somewhere down the road. At the end of June 1940, Adolf Hitler was the master of the European continent. The British had escaped with this miracle of Dunkirk, but there was no disguising the fact that Hitler and his allies completely dominated all of Europe. It was a victory on a scale that Hitler in his wildest dreams could not have anticipated. It was the high water mark of his popularity. The scene of German troops in Paris, something they had been denied for 4 years during the First War, they had now done in 35 days. The scene, and we'll close with this, of Hitler accepting the surrender at the armistice where you've probably seen the film, where he slaps his thigh in jubilation. British propaganda people got hold of this, ran it backward and forward so Hitler looks like he's doing a little jig over the body of recently deceased France. But it was a dark, dark day for Europe, for France, and for Western civilization.